Hi everyone. I just wanted to give you just a brief overview that has some reminders about kind of the mechanics of putting information from your sources into your essay. So this is a review of some things that we've talked about in the past. So when you are going to use information from a source, you first know what the idea is that you're trying to prove in your paragraph. You identify an idea in your source that goes along with what you're trying to say in your paper. You introduce the information from your source. You integrate the information from your source into your paper in the most effective way. You provide an in-text citation, and you interpret the information from your source so that your reader understands why it's relevant to your topic idea. So those are the basic steps. Let me break it down for you a little bit. So the first step is look back at your essay assignment and figure out what main idea it is that you're covering in your paper. And that idea then is going to be clearly stated in your thesis statement and then in the topic sentences for each one of your body paragraphs. So you've got those ideas very clearly stated in focused thesis and topic sentences. Then you go looking through your sources and you identify the information in your sources that is relevant to your paper's main ideas. So that's where you're reading through the information from your sources, and then you probably go back through the information from your sources to find all the different pieces of information, statistical data, anecdotes, stories, kind of testimonials from experts. Whatever information from your sources reinforces the ideas from your topic sentence. You want to look through your sources and identify those different pieces of information. Once you've identified a piece of information that you want to include in your paper, the next thing that you would want to do is figure out where it goes in your paper. And then when you're ready to put that piece of information, you decide whether you're going to summarize it or paraphrase it or quote it. But whichever strategy you use, you want to introduce your reader to the information from your source. And as you know, you do that with a signal phrase. You do that, sorry, that's my dog. You do that by giving information about what your source is, who the author is, perhaps the title of your source, probably some information about what that source overall is discussing. So maybe like a one-sentence summary of an article's main ideas. But you want to introduce that source to your reader, and you want your introduction to be thorough so that your reader knows what this source is and it starts to get an idea of why you would want to cite this source in your paper or reference information from this source in your paper. After you've provided a thorough introduction of your source, you take the information and you integrate it into your prose. So that's where if you're using a direct quote, you don't put a direct quote as a standalone sentence in your paper, but instead you do a mixture of kind of the most compellingly worded phrases or sentences from your source mixed with your writing. After you have integrated the source material into your paper, probably right away you're going to need an in-text citation. What goes in that citation is going to depend on what you put in your signal phrase, what is the beginning piece of information in the works cited entry, and also whether or not it is a paper or hard copy source or a digital or electronic source. But you want an in-text citation. That usually goes right after whatever you include from the source, but that citation does go before the closing punctuation. So you don't put the period before the parentheses, you put the period or the end punctuation after the parenthetical information. Next step is don't assume that your audience understands what is important about the idea from your source that you include. Instead, you want to interpret it. You want to explain it. You want to let your reader know how this information relates to the thing that you're trying to prove in your paragraph. And it's really important that you remember that your readers have not read the articles that you're quoting in your paper or referencing in your paper, but you have. And so that's where you're pointing back to the information in your quote or in your paraphrase and basically saying, this is what I want you to understand about the information in this quote, or this is the conclusion that I want you to draw based on the information from the quote. A lot of times that interpretive statement is going to begin with something like, this shows that, or this shows how. So that's how you can begin those interpretive explanatory statements. What I want to do now is just look at a sample student paper that is in your Norton Field Guide. So we're going to look at two different examples. If you want to look at your book, I'm on page 542 and 543 in your Norton Anthology. So this is the first full paragraph that appears on page 542. The topic idea is historians and political analysts alike cite Dewey's overly cautious campaign as one of the main reasons Truman was able to achieve victory. So the main idea in that topic sentence has to do with the campaign that Dewey ran. This is about a presidential election. So that's the topic idea, a cautious campaign. Then you've got an explanation. Dewey firmly believed in public opinion polls. Then I want you to look at this next sentence because this is where the writer introduces the information from the source. The introduction says this: with all indications pointing to an easy victory, Dewey and his staff believed that all he had to do was bide his time and make no foolish mistakes. So we're getting some information about this source, Smith, before we actually get the quote. So we've got that kind of contextual information, and then you've got the signal phrase, Dewey himself said, and then you notice there's a verb and then a comma, and then the quotation marks because this is a direct quote. When you're leading, don't talk. And then you've got the parenthetical citation right after it. This is a hard copy source, so we have a page number, but we don't have the letter P in there, the abbreviation, PG. It's just the author and the page number. And you've got the end of the parenthetical punctuation, and then look where that period is. It's on the other side of that in-text citation. But the writer doesn't just put that quote in there. The writer comes back afterwards and helps us understand what we're supposed to learn from that quote. Dewey said, when you're leading, don't talk. Each of Dewey's speeches was well crafted and well rehearsed. As the leader in the race, he kept his remarks faultlessly positive, with the result that he failed to deliver a solid message or even mention Truman or any of Truman's policies. Eventually, Dewey began to be perceived as aloof and stuffy. So in those sentences that follow, what you get is this writer of this paper helping us understand the conclusion that we're supposed to draw about this statement, when you're leading, don't talk. And basically what the student writer is saying is, leading by not talking is a mistake. It's too cautious. And as a result, there were these faultlessly positive comments, and then there was no real message. So this was too cautious, too overly cautious. So that's an example of kind of the mechanics, what it looks like to follow all of these steps. And I want you to look how many sentences there are. You've got the sentence that introduces the quote. That's one sentence that starts with all indications. Then you've got the quote itself, Dewey himself said, that's sentence number 2. Then you've got three sentences of interpretation afterwards. The sentence that starts with each of Dewey's speeches, then the sentence that starts with as the leader in the race, and then the sentence that begins with, eventually Dewey began to be perceived as aloof and stuffy. So I wanted to point that out because you really don't want to rush the process of interpreting and explaining the information from your source. You really want to spell it out for your reader. It's like you're the teacher and you are explaining and helping your reader understand what it is you want your reader to know or learn. So when you look back at that example, and you can even pause the video here in a minute and look back at it, notice whether the writer used paraphrase or direct quote. Think about why the writer decided to use paraphrase or quote. Notice what information is in the citation, what punctuation is in the citation. Notice where the end punctuation for the quote belongs or is put. Notice where the end punctuation for the sentence goes. So those are the things that I want you to notice in that previous example. Here's another example on page 543. Let's do the same thing. Topic idea. As his campaign continued, observers noticed or noted that Dewey seemed uncomfortable in crowds, unable to connect with ordinary people. There's your topic idea. Then you've got kind of a lead up to the quote. And he made a number of blunders. One took place at a train stop when the candidate, commenting on the number of children in the crowd, said he was glad they had been let out of school for his arrival. Unfortunately for Dewey, it was a Saturday. So right here, you get a little bit of information about what's happening in kind of this historical account. They're at a train stop and the candidate makes a statement about how many children are there. So we get kind of the storyline, and here the writer is using paraphrase instead of direct quote, and then we get the interpretation. Unfortunately for Dewey, it was a Saturday, and then more interpretations. Such gaffes, and gaffe is a mistake, such gaffes gave voters the feeling that Dewey was out of touch with the public. So there again, you've got the writer interpreting what that information from the source is trying to tell us. And you can see that interpretation, the idea that Dewey is out of touch with the public, reinforces the idea that's in the topic sentence, Dewey seemed uncomfortable in crowds. So there's another example of using information from a source in a paragraph. This time, the information is paraphrased instead of quoted. I want you to notice, too, what is in the parenthetical citation. Instead of an author and a page number, you've got something in quotation marks, 1948, The Great Truman Surprise. What that is the title of an article. And if you were to look at the Works Cited page for this paper, that would be the first piece of information in that Works Cited entry. So we don't have an author for that article. The other thing that you can conclude based on this parenthetical citation and what's in it is that this is information from an electronic source, so there is no page number. So again, does the writer use a paraphrase or direct quote? And the reason, remember, for why somebody would choose a direct quote is if the information from the source is being said in a way that's especially memorable or compelling, then you want to use direct quote. But if the information is something that you can say as well or better in your own words, more concisely, then you definitely want to use paraphrase. So that gets at why the writer made the choice of paraphrasing in this second example. We talked about what information is in the citation and why. We talked about the punctuation in the citation. The reason that that article title is in quotation marks inside the citations is because the title of an article is also punctuated with quotation marks. And so you use that same punctuation in the parenthetical citation. There are no quotation marks in the paragraph because there are no quotes in the paragraph. There's paraphrase. And then you noticed where the end punctuation for the sentence goes, again, on the outside of the parenthetical citation. So here's a quick recap. Be aware of what idea it is that you're trying to illustrate. You need to identify information from your source that reinforces that idea. Then, when you identify that information, what you want to do is introduce the information, introduce your source, tell your reader about the source, who the author is, what that author's credentials are, a general statement about what the source is discussing. So you introduce, it's like you're telling your reader, hello, I want you to meet this source. Let me tell you a little bit about this source, and then use a signal phrase and either use a direct quote or a paraphrase. And when you do that, you are integrating the information from your source into your prose. After that, you make sure that you include an in-text citation as needed, and then make sure that you interpret the information so that your reader has a clear understanding of what it is you want your reader to understand or learn from what you've included in your paragraph.